Greetings, everyone. My name is Dinah, and you're listening to Kinda Sorta Brown with the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Kinda Sorta Brown. This is the COVID-19 and the medical racism episode. So welcome back. We're excited to discuss health disparities in all of the communities in our country and even beyond globally. I'm one of your hosts for this episode, Daisy Okoye, your content creator for KSB. We also have Lena, and I'll let Lena sort of take it from here.
Thanks, Daisy. Daisy and I are really excited for this episode. So as Daisy said, my name's Lena Diasti. So I am, again, you've heard us on the intro, the first episode, and now we're really going to get into some of these conversations that we spoke about on that first episode. But I'm the executive producer, and we're really excited to have these conversations. Daisy and I have a lot of things planned for this episode, and you'll be hearing from amazing speakers like Symphony Fletcher, who graduated from the college and is now at UChicago Med, and also Dr. Aresha Martinez-Cardoso, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health and Sciences at UChicago as well. So both of those amazing humans are here to kind of discuss with us things that Daisy and I were really interested in learning about, and we're hoping that you as our listener and our KS fam will kind of join us in that. But again, our season theme is 2020, the Brown Breakdown. So we're breaking down everything with us as a team, with our speakers, our KS fam, and also make sure to engage with us on social media after the episode. But let's get into the Melanin Archives.
Let's dig into the Melanin Archives.
In this installment of the Melanin Archives, we'd like to take you all back to the 20th century, specifically Macomb County, Alabama, to a town of black sharecroppers called Tuskegee. The infamous Tuskegee Syphilis Study, officially titled the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, was a government-funded, CDC and Public Health Service-backed study involving 399 black men, each of whom was persuaded to enter a so-called syphilis treatment trial that would last for 6 months in 1932. But the study ended up lasting for 40 years. 40 years during which researchers observed the progression of the disease in these men until their deaths. Throughout the study, the men were denied proper penicillin treatment when it became the norm in the 40s. They were given placebos, denied by local physicians, died of syphilis complications, went insane, and even passed it on to their wives and children. A whistleblower published the study and ended it effectively in 1972. There was a $10 million settlement with the survivors, a funded apology from Bill Clinton in 1997, where certain measures were instituted to highlight ethics in the research realm. But this study acted as somewhat of an epicenter, or as researchers from a 2017 study would call it, the site of initial exposure in a trust-destroying event. The most severe trust-breaking effect was among people similar to the original Tuskegee men. In other words, poorer, black, southern, rural individuals. And this distrust of the medical community from people of color and marginalized groups is something that we'll continue to talk about in the KST.
KST. It's piping hot.
This Tuskegee syphilis experiment, this study, was an immense breaking of trust for so many Black Americans and these communities. And this distrust led to poor health outcomes because in conjunction with a lack of effective communication and this distrust between physician and patients, specifically patients of color, underrepresented in clinical trials for new drugs, even new procedures, it all collaborates into an effect that creates poorer health outcomes across the board. And we're talking about racial fantasies of hardiness in Black people where we somehow need less care, we're less sensitive than people of other communities. We are the simpler race. These are all notions that have been thrown around and they're simply not true, but they're harming marginalized peoples. All of this sort of strains our relationships.
Exactly that. And it's funny because we see that this is happening, right, in a very formalized way. This is a study. It seems like it's happening by researchers. So how did this actually happen? But we also see that, I think the argument comes up pretty often, Daisy, right? If someone's saying, well, research now is more educated, they're not doing these things. But then we ask ourselves, what are these implicit ways that physicians who, are teaching, who are practicing still, who may have been taught something that somewhat like their mentor was taught, and it just is like this generational thing where it's just passed down. And that's something that I was really thinking about as we were kind of doing the Melanin archives of, okay, it happened, people say, okay, this happened like 50 years ago, but the stories and how people teach is so ingrained in the culture of like what the medical care practice is. And that's why I'm excited to talk to Symphony in just a little bit, to just see more of like, what's that experience now as like first year med student.
And within the medical community, we're seeing, again, these relationships being strained, but this lens of seeing it through sort of a racialized perspective is both new and incredibly old. We are now seeing it used to identify the impact in the SARS coronavirus 2 or the novel coronavirus, this pandemic across the globe. There are so many confounding factors that aren't limited to the United States. Though it's easy to feel this way, we have to look at it in a broader view. And I'll give you the numbers, but don't settle on this as being enough of an understanding. According to the University of Oxford's Our World in Data Statistics, 916,005 people have been killed by this virus worldwide. More than 5,878 people died today. And I say more than because we all know that the reported numbers don't see everyone. Many of these people will never be found, and the people that died today could fill the University of Chicago's faculty population twice. All of the 916,000 reported deaths nearly double the number of travelers who went to Rio in 2016 to attend the Summer Olympics, back when we had the somewhat now forgotten Zika virus to worry over. And speaking of the cancellation of the 2020 Olympics, so many uplifting and unifying events that have been put on hold are sure to have major psychological impacts, and we're all now feeling some of these impacts today, or at least the beginnings of them.
Yeah, Daisy, that's definitely something, like these unifying moments, like right now, like in Saudi Arabia, Hajj, which is this very important pilgrimage for all Muslims to make from Mecca to Medina. Like usually it's millions of people, 2.5 million people went last year to make the pilgrimage. That is part of, it's one of the pillars of Islam. And now we're going down to 1,000 people who this summer who are only allowed to, go and do this pilgrimage, which is extremely meaningful and important. And people plan for this like years in advance. And, this is one thing that people lose in this grand scheme of like what COVID has impacted people. But, it's something that reminds you, it reminds you why you love people, why you, like the whole thing, in Islam is like peace be upon others, peace be upon people. And it's COVID, it's like it's so ironic. It's like juxtaposing in this way that COVID is not giving anybody peace. Like no one has peace. And I think that just kind of perpetuates this emotional and cultural distress that we're seeing now.
Exactly right. All of the factors that COVID-19 is now exposing in the fabric of what makes us human and what makes us connected, and the support systems that we lean on as a society, from the Hajj to even the Olympics. We have to think more holistically about health. We have to think outside of ourselves. We have to think into these systems so we know how to support each other in the best way. And COVID-19 is really making us see all of that. When in Wuhan, China, this became the epicenter of the virus, certain individuals pushed to call it the China virus or the Kung flu, yet again demonizing a group of color. An enemy was made of those hurting. Just look how Asian American communities in Chicago's Chinatown were treated after that. It's all of these support systems are being attacked from different levels, and that's really something that we have to understand and focus on.
Right, and I think it's so jarring to see that it's not only right now what we're seeing happening with the language that was initially being used and now still continue being used with these derogatory names, but seeing how it's affecting businesses and communities now in the States. We're seeing that businesses in Chinatown, in Chinatown in Chicago, they're only getting about 30% of their regular businesses, some business owners are talking about. And these are like very well-known places. This is, Triple Crown, which is a restaurant that most Chicago students know pretty well and visited pretty, frequently during regular, school years. So that drop of business is like really impacting the entire community right now. And then also being, further shamed by someone who is supposed to be uniting and leading, a country that is known and claims diversity because of its supposed welcoming nature. Something that I think is like an honorable mention that I want to really acknowledge right now is, so back in 1991, Johns Hopkins founded the Center of American Indian Health, and they've been doing really important work throughout COVID, because right now they have over 140 tribal communities in over 21 states that are kind of partnered with the American Indian Health Center at Johns Hopkins. So that's something that, again, not something that the US is particularly focusing on research, but again, it's these private leading health centers that are doing the research and are really helping bringing access to communities who are right now facing a lot of uncertainty with COVID from a nation that has historically and consistently ignored their needs.
Right. And with these like historically ignored and underrepresented, you could say erasure of trauma and silencing of these populations, the Yakama Nation in Washington and 150,000 deep Navajo Nation endure crowded housing conditions, years of underfunded health systems, food and water insecurity, and other social determinants of health, which we will get into with one of our wonderful guests in the Brown Breakdown. But these factors interact in a way that results in poorer health outcomes across the board. Imagine you're in labor and you are requesting a specific pain medication or any sort of treatment, and you are being refused care not because you don't need it, but because you are not believed to need it. All of this, if you haven't noticed already, this is the medical racism that we're talking about. Even in a book I've been reading called Black and Blue, we are made to acknowledge the two tenets of Western racialized notions of how Black was viewed for a long time and explicitly as the inferior race, with some inherent immunities to disease or even pain in some instances and susceptibility to others, where just as every other aspect of society, the medical community has absorbed some of this silent curriculum of racially charged practices and teachings and contributes largely silently to disparities in care. And those two tenets of the racialized notions would be that like Black or the Black race is hardier or less susceptible to certain diseases and more simple. So our body or physiological systems are more simple and therefore less susceptible to like psychological issues of sensitivity. We feel less pain, quote unquote, and we feel less of these poor health outcomes. In all of this, we really wanted to talk and define what implicit bias is, because that's kind of where this conversation is heading. Though we'll discuss this in more detail with our guests and its effect on treatment and care. From the Perception Institute, thoughts and feelings are implicit if we are unaware of them or mistaken about their nature. We have a bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or aversion to a person or a group of people. The term implicit bias then describes instances when we display attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. So this is what we talk about when we say implicit bias. And it's really important that we have that as a foundation.
Exactly, Daisy. And I think it's like really important where, me or anyone else, we could say like, oh, I don't have implicit biases, but it's important to note that like everybody has implicit biases, biases. Like it's not that one person has, gone through all the trials of life and they've seen everything. So there's no way that they could have an implicit bias. Everyone has them, but they are malleable. They're not set in stone. They're not just declared beliefs that can never change. And I think that that's really important because you have the power to change it, right? So you as an individual have incredible amount of power over how you interact with people, the things you think about, but we all have them. And that's something that follows through in a lot of the discussions that we'll be talking about, is taking a moment to accept that implicit biases, like they do exist and everyone has them. And it doesn't make someone a better or worse person by having them. It's what they do to change those biases and making sure that they don't act on them if they hurt, harm, or impact other people negatively. But something that I also find incredibly interesting, right? So like Daisy, when we talk about, Daisy brought up the story in Little Village, and I was wondering, Daisy, if you could talk about it a little bit, because I think you said some really interesting points.
I stumbled upon this article about what was happening in Little Village